peace, and the fact that they now have taken a bit of Russia and they are looking to open those potential peace negotiations in the autumn does give them more to play for, so that if they talk, for example, about a freeze in the current conflict, Russia is not going to want there to be a freeze under the current situation with Kursk being occupied, which means that they'll have to give something back to the Ukrainians.
Lots of news in the last couple of days about Labour and the rail unions. Has Labour been played? ASLEF announcing new strikes just days after agreeing a significant pay rise with the government that was supposed to avoid strikes.
Well, it's a difficult one to sort of look at, because you can kind of understand why they've done what they've done. I mean, the argument that the government is making is that they've given them an offer because actually the amount of money that the rail strikes has cost the country has been significant, and that actually they think sort of adhering to their request and offering them something along the lines of what they wanted is actually going to unblock some of the kind of economic damage that's been done. At the same time, it does open the door to some big questions, particularly now they've basically immediately launched into a new round of strikes over a different complaint, this time about bullying claims. And that is a little embarrassing for the government, I think, because basically they've tried to fix it. They've said, look, we're going to put all this money in to actually stop this being a problem, to stop the economic damage that's going to happen. But actually it's now going to go on for another 3 months. So the capital and the win isn't really going to be there, because they're not going to see the fruits of these discussions yet for several months' time. So it's not great news for them. But I think they would probably argue that actually in the long term it's the right thing to do. The other question mark, obviously, it throws up is this is now going to open the door to all the other
everybody
unions
else,
asking for similar bumper pay rises.
The border force are going on strike as well, I believe.
Yes. And I think, you can see that there's going to be a kind of big kind of ricochet effect on this. I mean, the argument from ASLEF is they say, well, we haven't had a pay rise for 5 years. And obviously that means that it's a sort of cumulative effect. But at the same time, it is going to be a bit of a kind of moment for the government, particularly when they're trying to dig their way out of a black hole. And yet they're going to find themselves with yet bigger and bigger pay demands.
I mean, this seems like exactly what Labour doesn't want to happen, because what the government's whole stance is, all these Labour disputes have been gridlocked for years because the Tories were useless. In we come and we solve them. And yet, if actually what happens is in they come, and instead of solving them, they hand out loads of money and still don't solve them. I mean, that's the critique of Labour governments from time immemorial, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think also just the fact that, that was the big boast, wasn't it? The big boast was, we're going to fix this, we're going to solve this. The unions are intrinsically involved in the Labour movement. They are the paymasters, they bankroll several MPs, they pay their subs to the party, etc., etc. So there is a kind of, symbiotic relationship between the two things. So you would expect that this would be a much more seamless process, as it were, particularly if they are opening the purse strings. And yet, as I said, they're not going to get the win out of this that they wanted as immediately as perhaps they would have liked.
We're a month away from the Labour Party conference, their first in government. Do you think that fights with unions are going to be a big feature of that?
Well, they have been. I mean, it would almost be not a Labour conference if we didn't see a kind of fight with the union. I mean, they've been less of a kind of issue recently than they used to be, and that's partly been because of the way in which the financial arrangements exist between the two has been eroded, particularly, since we've seen Jeremy Corbyn leave the party when he had a particular relationship with the unions and a stronger relationship with the unions. Unite has been kind of gradually distancing itself more and more, and obviously there's been other unions that have been quite critical of the Labour movement in some process. If you remember the whole row around the North Sea oil crisis, and some of the unions there coming out and being quite critical. So it's not quite a kind of cozy a relationship as perhaps there once was. But as I say, there isn't really a Labour Party conference where there isn't a story about the unions sort of duffing them up in some way. And obviously one of the rows that is kind of brewing is all over the workers' rights agenda. We've already seen suggestions that that's going to be delayed. That had always been a kind of mission that was going to be introduced within the first 100 days of a Labour government. We're, 40 days in already? So time is already of the essence. And I think that will become a bigger and bigger issue as we move into the autumn.
Sure. Let's talk about free speech. The government has been having, well, I was going to say the government has been having a fight with Elon Musk. I'm not sure that's true because the government doesn't seem to necessarily be noticing it's having a fight with Elon Musk. Elon Musk's been having a fight with the government, but he's basically been highlighting the various prosecutions there have been over riots and over speech on social media that is deemed contributing to the riots and the sentencing and so on. And there is a narrative emerging in some parts of the media and some part of our political sphere that this government is a sort of a free speech disaster, that we are at the beginning of a real crackdown on free speech, which seems to relate only sort of tangentially to what the government itself believes itself to be doing. Do you see this sort of thing as becoming a real proper problem for the government that they have to take seriously, or will they just continue to ignore it?
Not at the moment is the answer. I think if it continues to bubble, it could be something that kind of, almost snowballs into becoming a story. I mean, I think at the moment, the government's response to this, although it's not doing it sort of publicly, is it is ignoring it, partly because it sees it as being unhelpful in terms of the narrative and the trajectory around the riots. And it doesn't want to do anything that kind of inflames those kind of accusations again, which were kind of prevalent in the riots, that, people weren't being told the truth. There was a crackdown on people being able to talk about various things on social media because it was inflaming tensions, particularly with the far right. I think at the moment, given that we're only sort of 10 days out from the kind of riot sort of situation, sort of quietening down, I think the government probably feels that it's actually doing the right thing, that it's trying to be as sort of standing back as much as it possibly can. It doesn't want to do anything that kind of inflames those tensions anymore. And I think it will be hoping that those kind of criticisms go away. I think if it started to kind of invade other areas beyond that, which is kind of tangentially related to the riots, then I think you could make an argument for that. But I think at the moment, the plan is just to keep things as quiet as possible, to take the heat out of everything as much as possible. We do finally seem to be in a slightly Augusty moment, which we haven't had during recess thus far. It's been a fairly news-intensive time. And I think that they just want to keep a lid on everything as much as they possibly can. Now, that may or may not happen. It'll be interesting to see what happens if the Middle East situation escalates, and that's always a possibility. We see that there are sort of those ceasefire discussions going on at the moment, and Iran has been effectively sort of persuaded, or seems to have been persuaded at the moment, to not do anything until we get to some kind of conclusion on that. And we've heard today, that Biden thinks that this is, the most positive that the discussions have ever been since the October the 7th massacre. If that doesn't go well, and I think, we end up in a situation where things do blow up again, that may be a moment, particularly given the concerns that some of the Labour supporters have about the party's stance on Israel, where you start to see some of these issues bubble up again. But at the moment, I think they're
trying very hard to
they
not go
want
there.
this to be a quieter moment in recess for people to go away. I understand that aside from the Prime Minister, I think there are more ministers now packing up and going on their holidays. They all had to delay, or certainly those that were involved in the response to the riots couldn't go away in the first part of August. And I think everybody just wants to go away and have a bit of a break before we come back for conference season and, of course, the party's first budget.
If only they can get on a train.
Yes,
Let's talk briefly about Nigel Farage. He is, of course, now an MP for Reform in Clacton. Revealed this morning that he earned 1.2 million in the last year as a presenter for GB News. So Labour talked a lot about cracking down on second jobs for MPs. They also said that the media roles was not going to be a part of that. 1.2 million is quite, I don't know what you're paid, Caroline, I don't mean to assume. 1.2 million is quite a lot of money, even in this gig.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, and I think, and I think that, this is something where there are always questions which are asked about this, particularly, Nigel Farage has received those questions already when he was seen, at the Trump rally, for example, within a couple of days of being elected as an MP, and question marks about what do your constituents in Clacton think about, the time that you're dedicating to doing the casework. Well, it is a big job.
It raises the question of which one of these is your real job.
Exactly. But it's been the same question in time immemorial. And actually, what you'll find when you read through the Register of Members' Interest is that whilst that is an eye-watering sum of money, there are others that earn more, and often in the sphere of the legal world, where there are barristers that are earning multiple millions of pounds representing cases. And again, that question mark is a valid one, which is your first job, which is your second job, and actually, do you have the time to do the job on behalf of your constituents? But look, we live in a democracy. There is a way to get rid of your MP, that is to not vote for them. People have a choice, and I guess people will vote with their feet ultimately at the end of Nigel's 5-year term. If they're not happy with the work that he's put in, he'll be booted out.
Well, and one should at least acknowledge the absolute countervailing argument, which is maybe he's better value as an MP for Clacton because he has this huge media profile, and the two things are they can't necessarily be disentangled in that way. Very finally, before I let you go, Ukraine making inroads into Russia this past week, and there's a lot of complexity over precisely what British-made weapons they're allowed to use and how. Where do you think the government is about all this? Are they sitting back and being like, entirely delighted Russia is getting a bloody nose, or is there a bit of trepidation about where this could lead?
I think a bit of both. I mean, you have to look at what's happened in Kursk. I mean, it's an audacious bid, actually invading Russia, but not just invading it, but actually making significant inroads. And having been there now for multiple numbers of days, again, it kind of brings back memories of those first days of the invasion where everybody thought that Ukraine would be overrun within 2 weeks, and that didn't happen. So, of course, everybody's sitting back with a little bit of a chortle that Russia's getting a little bit of a taste of its own medicine. But look, I think there are some anxieties. There's been lots of question marks about whether Storm Shadow can be used within the vicinity of Russia. And I think the MOD are quite nervous about that particular issue because obviously nobody wants to kind of end up in a situation where Russia feels that it has to retaliate against the West for their support. They seem to be fairly robust in what they're saying at the moment in terms of other kit. And of course, there was an aid package that was given to Ukraine in the first days of the Labour government with some significant kit at that particular time. And they're not saying whether or not that should or should not be used. They seem to be fairly relaxed, particularly about the challenges going in. I think Storm Shadow is the one that raises the biggest questions for them. But it's interesting. I've been speaking to people within the Ukrainian government over the last couple of days about what they think about this invasion. And there's a lot of nervousness within Ukraine about it too. These are elite forces that they've put into this operation. If the elite forces are isolated at some point, if Putin does get serious about shutting down this incursion and those elite forces are wiped out, then it does raise and pose very serious questions about the defence of the rest of Ukraine. So I think, there are still some within the Ukrainian government who are sort of slightly worried, concerned, anxious about the new direction of travel. But look, I mean, there are obviously strategic reasons why they are doing this. And the fact that they now have taken a bit of Russia and they are looking to open those potential peace negotiations in the autumn does give them more to play for, so that if they talk, for example, about a freeze in the current conflict, Russia is not going to want there to be a freeze under the current situation with Kursk being occupied, which means that they'll have to give something back to the Ukrainians. So, you can understand the kind of strategy behind it, but I think it is still a very high-risk gamble.
Yeah, absolutely. What a time. Anyway, thank you very much indeed, Caroline Wheeler. That's Caroline Wheeler of the Sunday Times, and you can read Caroline in the paper tomorrow or with a digital subscription via thetimes.com.